Okay, so the new Dune film is out, and I really enjoyed it.
This prophecy is how they enslave us! You are not prepared for what is to come.
But before I begin the review, I've got to say that I can't compare it to the books, the old films, the miniseries, because I've never watched or read them, so I can only look at this and the 2021 movie as films in their own right. Right off the bat, I will say, if you liked the first 2021 Dune movie, I think you're really going to like Dune Part 2. But if the first film just didn't do it for you, I don't really see this one changing your mind. Because Dune Part 2 takes everything that the first film did, the tone, the style, and just dials it all to 11. It's more of the same thing, but even better. And I personally loved it. It was such a brilliant cinematic experience. There are those films out there where I'm okay with waiting a few months, watching them on a streaming service, but this isn't one of them. It's one that you've got to go out to the cinema to see. Everything in this film, and indeed the first one, just feels big. From the performances, to the action, to the cinematography. It's all firing on all cylinders, and comes together to create this powerhouse of an epic sci-fi. And having no background knowledge of Dune when I watched the first one, it made me feel like I was a kid again watching Star Wars for the first time. Because those three films were the first big epic sci-fi films that I ever saw. And yeah, I know, Star Wars prequels, but the point I'm making is they were Star Wars when I was a kid. That was my introduction into sci-fi, and as a child I loved them, and they just blew my mind, and no other sci-fi film has ever made me feel that way. Until the new Dune films. Feel like I should throw in a quick disclaimer with that one. I am not in any way saying that the writing, or indeed just the general quality of the Star Wars prequels are on par with the new Dune films. No, not at all. The new Dune films far surpass the Star Wars prequels.
No shit.
I'm only saying that as a child, I was born in '93, so I was like 6 at the time that Phantom Menace came out, but that trilogy of films just blew my mind. They were my introduction to an epic sci-fi cinematic experience. And no sci-fi film has ever really wowed me as much since, and I get it, I was a kid, it was the first time watching any sci-fi film, so that is the one that's always going to stand out to me. It's not a great comparison, but what I'm trying to say is the new Dune films are bloody good.
You've been fighting the Harkonnens for decades.
Load!
My family's been fighting them for centuries.
So I'm going to keep this spoiler-free for part 2, but there will be spoilers for part 1, so you have been warned. The story of Dune centres around two rival houses. House Atreides, which are front and centre in this movie as the good guys. Or are they? Good is a matter of perspective after all. And this is a light theme in the sequel, and I say light because the main character, played brilliantly by Timothée Chalamet, does something towards the end of the film, and it's one of those situations where what he is doing, he believes he is right, but at what cost? What is he becoming? Is he losing himself? Then it's House Harkonnen, and they're straight up dicks. You just have to look at the design of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen to know that they are villains. Speaking of him, I must say that Stellan Skarsgård does an excellent job in that role. His performance is top notch. And then we have the Emperor, who is played by Christopher Walken of all people. And this is one of my few criticisms of the film. I just thought his character was boring. He is certainly a side character, but at one point I felt that he was being built up to be the big bad villain behind the villain. And then he just sort of gets slapped to the side. Of course, the biggest crime there is, how do you make Christopher Walken boring? That's just not right. But I digress. The Emperor, who was not in the first film, but did issue an order off-screen to have House Atreides replace the Baron as fief holder of the desert planet Arrakis, which is where the spice is, the only source of spice in the universe, and spice is incredibly important because It's a psychotropic drug that enables people to interstellar travel. So you can kind of see why in an epic sci-fi space world, that's kind of a big deal. But anyway, when they got there in the first film, they were betrayed, and the Emperor helped the Arcanins kill them. And most of them died, which is where part 2 picks up from. So because of that betrayal, this film is definitely partially a revenge... Well, not really partially, it is a revenge story. Because all the survivors of House Atreides, Paul, his mother, Josh Brolin, can't remember the character's name, they're all out for blood, they want vengeance, completely understandably, and their performances really carry this. It's very effective. But the film isn't entirely a revenge story, because it does focus on the Fremen, who are natives of the Arrakis desert world, and they learn to survive in this desert and adapt to its harsh conditions. They even learn to utilise the dreaded sandworms that live in the sand. That sounded better in my head, but graboids are definitely cooler, just saying. As for the Fremen themselves, I really liked them. They weren't just a collective group of oppressed people, they all had their individual personalities. Some were funny, some were sarcastic, some were just downright serious. My favourite of them was definitely Javier Bardem's character, but to be fair, he is one of those actors that can read any line of dialogue and I'm just hooked. But I can't not mention Zendaya as Chani. She was brilliant, but it does lead me onto a little bit of criticism, which is that they build a romance around her character and Paul Atreides, and I didn't think it worked that well. It wasn't terrible, but I didn't think it was a believable romance. It just felt rushed, and the problem wasn't the acting at all, far from it. I think it was a victim of the fact that there's just so much going on in these films. They're both like 2 hours 30, 2 hours 40, but there's so much happening, and you need more time to cultivate a romance. And especially when you consider the fact that Zendaya's character doesn't meet Timothy's character until the second film, or until the very end of the first film. You just don't have that much time to build up that romance, so it just felt rushed. I will say though, it's not a massive issue. I've definitely seen worse. Far, far worse. See, there you go. I said that I loved the prequels as a kid, and now I'm slagging them off.
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
Also, the way this film ends, because of what the main character does, which I'm not going to say, but you kind of start thinking, is he on the wrong path? Is he losing too much of himself? Zendaya's character is not happy about this. There's a lot of angry facial expressions towards the end of the film. Very good angry facial expressions, but I can't wait to see where they go with this.
You will never lose me as long as you stay who you are.
So let's talk about the villains. As mentioned before, Skarsgård returns as Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, and his performance, he just knocks it out of the park. Dave Bautista also returns as his Enforcer, and his character was okay. I like Bautista. I think he does have more range as an actor than most people give him credit, or at least the people I know. But his character wasn't that interesting. He's just sort of his Enforcer. He's kind of like a glorified henchman. He's just angry all the time and he's shouting and chewing scenery because the Fremen are getting away again, Atreides isn't dead. He's just serviceable. Then we have his sadistic and twisted brother, played brilliantly by Austin Butler, who delivers the villain that I wanted for this film. A brutal, without mercy killing machine, hunting down Paul and the Fremen. Sadly, he wasn't in the film as much as I wanted him to be, but the scenes that he did have were pure gold. Last thing I will say about his character is that he has a really good fight scene with Paul towards the end of the film. Without going into spoilers about why they are fighting, I will say that you get the weight of that fight. Everything that was at stake, all the movie was building up towards, it depended on the outcome of that fight. And it was great. It was gritty, vicious, and everything you wanted from these characters squaring off against each other. So yeah, on the whole, I did like the villains in this film, but I do feel like they could have done more villaining. But what they did do was certainly still good. The action overall was epic, brilliantly crafted by everyone who worked on the movie. with the standout moment being when Paul learnt to ride the giant sandworms. Paul and the Fremen use these giant earthworms, 3 of them come crashing into the Harkonnen stronghold and the Emperor for the final battle of the film. And before I wrap up, I just want to mention Timothée Chalamet again. I mentioned before that he did a great job in that performance, but I just want to add emphasis onto it. His character evolved so much in these 2 films, it's like he had to play multiple people. In the first, he was a duke's son and was learning his role to one day ascend and become the leader of House Atreides, whilst also being a chosen one type figure on his mother's side. Because she was part of a sisterhood who believed that she would have a daughter who would have a son that would become a messiah-like figure. But she had a son instead, and they believed that to be a rash mistake and that he could never live up to this. So in the first film, his performance has to reflect the difficulties of ascending into a royal position, as well as finding out that his mother is part of this sisterhood and that means he's going to be some sort of chosen one. And then in the second film, he meets the Fremen and becomes a messiah-like figure to them. So he has all of these 3 things all going on at the same time, and his performance doesn't skip a beat. He melds it all together brilliantly, and it works so well. Overall, I will say that Dune Part 2 is a fantastic film. Please go and see it in the cinema. Don't wait for streaming, DVD, Blu-ray, 4K Blu-ray even. Please go and see it in the cinema. It is a fantastic experience. You will not regret this, especially if you're a fan of sci-fi. For me, it's a 9 out of 10. Not quite a 10 out of 10 because there are a few problems. Very few films are a 10 out of 10 to be fair. 9 out of 10, fantastic film. Go and see it. You've been watching Good or Bad, and if you've enjoyed today's video, please go and hit those like and subscribe buttons, and I will see you next time.